On that Sunday evening in my dining room, my daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye and said, "You don't even understand money." My son laughed, really laughed. I decided to check for myself, so I hired someone to prove her wrong. But what he found almost destroyed me. If you are watching this video, don't forget to like, share, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far my story of betrayal has traveled. It wasn't a warm laugh, you have to understand that. It wasn't the kind that comes from love or gentle teasing between family members who care about each other. This was cold, sharp, cutting through the air like a blade designed to wound. This was dismissive, calculated, meant to put me in my place in front of my own children at my own table. Have you ever been disrespected in your own home by someone you welcomed with open arms? Have you ever felt that specific kind of humiliation that comes when a guest violates the sanctuary you've built? I felt my jaw tighten involuntarily, the muscles clenching so hard I thought my teeth might crack. My hand trembled slightly around the stem of my wine glass, and I was terrified someone would notice. I forced a smile because that's what I'd always done. I'd spent 68 years keeping the peace, smoothing over rough edges, making sure everyone around me felt comfortable even when I didn't. But something about that moment felt fundamentally different, like a door closing that could never be opened again. The air in the room changed, became thick and heavy despite the summer heat drifting through the open windows. Despite the warmth outside, a coldness crept into the space between us. It settled on my skin like frost, raising goosebumps on my arms even though the temperature hadn't changed. The wine on my tongue suddenly tasted bitter, metallic, wrong. I swallowed it down anyway. I looked around the table at my children, searching their faces for acknowledgement that what had just happened was wrong. Richard, my eldest at 42, had his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, his eyes darting between Hattie and me with clear discomfort. Kate, my only daughter, shifted in her seat and wouldn't meet my eyes, her fingers playing nervously with the edge of her napkin. They felt it too, that wrongness that had entered our family circle like poison in the well. But it was Daniel's reaction that cut the deepest. My youngest son, my baby, the one who used to call me every single morning before work just to say hello and ask about my day, the one I'd held closest to my heart who'd always been gentle and kind and protective of me. He sat there in absolute silence, not defending me, not telling his wife she'd crossed a line that should never be crossed. He just took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine and looked away. His eyes couldn't meet mine, wouldn't meet mine, and in that avoidance I saw everything I needed to know. That silence spoke volumes louder than any words could have. In that terrible moment of his cowardice, I understood with brutal clarity that he'd already chosen sides, and it wasn't mine. Hattie leaned back in her chair, my chair, the one at the head of the table where I'd sat for 30 years building this family. Her arms crossed over her chest, and that satisfied little smirk played at the corners of her mouth like she'd won something. She wasn't just being dismissive of my intelligence or my capabilities. She was being territorial, marking her space, acting like she already owned everything in this house, including my son's loyalty. The clinking of silverware against my grandmother's china seemed deafening in the silence that followed. The hum of the ceiling fan above us, rhythmic and constant, suddenly felt oppressive rather than comforting. Even the distant sound of traffic from the street outside penetrated the walls, and everything felt too loud, too present, too real. The suffocating silence after her laugh wrapped around my throat like hands squeezing. I understood money better than anyone at that table. I understood sacrifice and risk and investment and growth and protecting what you've built. But in that moment, I smiled anyway because that's what mothers do. I kept the peace because that's who I'd trained myself to be over a lifetime of putting everyone else's comfort above my own truth. "Perhaps you're right, dear," I heard myself say, and my voice sounded steady even as something fundamental inside me cracked and splintered. It was a lie, and we both knew it, but I wrapped it in politeness and swallowed my pride. I watched her eyes light up with victory, and I wondered how I'd missed seeing this side of her before now. As they gathered their coats to leave, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Hattie whispered something to Daniel near the front door, her hand on his arm, her mouth close to his ear. He nodded slowly, seriously, his expression grave and focused in a way that felt rehearsed. Their heads were close together, conspiratorial, sharing secrets that deliberately excluded everyone else in the room, including me. What were they planning in my own hallway? Why the secrecy, the whispered conversations, the meaningful looks that shut me out? I felt like an intruder in my own home, watching a play where I didn't know the script. The exclusion was deliberate, calculated, and it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. After they left, I sat alone at that table for a long time. The dinner remnants grew cold around me, congealing on plates that nobody had bothered to help clear. Empty chairs where my children had sat just moments before now felt like monuments to something precious that was slipping through my fingers like water. The house felt bigger, emptier, colder than it ever had before. I didn't know it then, but that single laugh would cost me everything I'd built over 4 decades. It would cost me my peace of mind, my sense of security, my relationship with my youngest child, and nearly my life itself. That laugh was the beginning of a nightmare I couldn't have imagined in my worst fears. It was a warning I was too blind, too trusting, too loving to see for what it truly was. That laugh wasn't just disrespect or rudeness or a daughter-in-law overstepping her bounds. It was a declaration of war, a signal that I was already under attack and didn't even know it. It was the sound of someone who believed they'd already won, who thought I was too old and too foolish to fight back. 3 weeks later, I discovered I couldn't access my own bank accounts, and the empire I'd built with my bare hands was slipping through my fingers like sand. How many excuses do you make for the people you love when your gut is screaming that something isn't right? I've asked myself these questions 1,000 times since everything fell apart, and I still don't have a good answer. I only know that love makes you blind, and trust makes you vulnerable in ways you can't understand until it's too late. I started noticing things in the weeks after that dinner, small things at first, easy to explain away, easy to dismiss as coincidence or oversight or my own paranoia. Unsigned checks began piling up on my desk in stacks I didn't remember creating. Delayed payrolls for the factory workers started becoming a pattern rather than an exception, and these were people who depended on me, who'd worked for me loyally for years. During our morning call, I mentioned it to Daniel as casually as I could manage. I tried to keep my voice light, tried not to sound accusatory or worried, tried to be the understanding mother rather than the suspicious boss. But even as I spoke, something felt off about the whole conversation. His responses were too quick, too dismissive, too rehearsed. "Mom, you're worrying too much," he said, and his tone made my skin prickle with unease. He wasn't reassuring me the way he used to when I had genuine concerns about the business. He was talking to me like I was a confused child who didn't understand what was happening in her own company. "You know how you get anxious about details that don't really matter. I've got this handled, I promise." But he didn't have it handled, I would discover. Or maybe he did have it handled, just not in the way I thought, just not in a way that protected me or my interests. Maybe he had it handled perfectly for his own purposes. Maybe every word out of his mouth was a carefully constructed lie designed to keep me calm while they worked in the shadows. Late one evening, I returned to the office for some financial documents I'd forgotten. The building was dark and empty, my footsteps echoing in the hallway in a way that made me feel alone and vulnerable. That's when I found her, sitting at my desk like she had every right to be there, my company laptop open in front of her. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, typing something she clearly didn't want me to see. "Just helping Daniel with the quarterly taxes," she said when she noticed me standing in the doorway. She closed the laptop with a decisive click that felt too final, too guilty. She smiled at me, but the warmth never reached her calculating eyes, those cold eyes that I'd mistaken for friendly. I nodded and pretended to believe her because what else could I do without proof, without evidence, without anything but a growing sense of dread? The next morning, I tried to log into the financial systems I'd built and managed for 3 decades. These were systems I'd designed, passwords I'd created, accounts I accessed every single day without fail. I typed in my credentials carefully, double-checking each character before hitting enter. The screen flashed red, access denied. I tried again, certain I'd just mistyped in my morning fog. Maybe I'd hit the wrong key. Maybe my fingers had slipped, maybe I was just tired and careless. But the screen showed the same cruel message, more insistent this time: invalid password. My heart sank into my stomach like a stone dropping into deep, dark water where it would never be recovered. I called Daniel immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. My voice probably sounded panicked, desperate, confused, all the things I was feeling but trying to hide. He answered on the third ring, and I could hear traffic in the background like he was driving somewhere. When I explained what happened, he actually sighed, a sound of pure irritation that cut through me like glass. "We changed the passwords for cybersecurity, remember?" His tone suggested I was being unreasonable, forgetful, difficult. "That breach last month? We talked about this, Mom. I'll send you the new credentials as soon as I get to the office." But he never did send them, not that day or the next or the day after that. Every time I asked, there was a new excuse, a new delay, a new reason why it hadn't happened yet. If you've ever questioned your own instincts because someone made you feel crazy or overdramatic, you understand this torture. If you've ever been gaslit by someone you love, you know how it feels to doubt your own perception of reality. I started wondering if I was losing my mind, if age was catching up with me, if I was imagining threats that didn't exist. Maybe Daniel was right and I was just anxious, just paranoid, just a worried old woman who couldn't let go of control. That evening, Kate called me from her office downtown. "Mom, have you looked at the quarterly reports?" Her voice was tight with concern, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Something feels off to me. The international transfers don't match the invoices we received, and the numbers just don't add up the way they should." I found myself defending Daniel to my own daughter. The words came automatically, reflexively, because mothers defend their children even when the evidence suggests they shouldn't. "He's just being cautious about security, sweetheart. You know how protective he is of the company and our assets." But even as the words left my mouth, doubt gnawed at me like a persistent ache in my chest that wouldn't go away. At Richard's birthday dinner the following week, Hattie made another slip. We were discussing the company's 5-year expansion plans, projects that had been in development for months with input from all the senior staff. She leaned forward in her chair and said quite casually, like it was already decided, "When we expand the international branch under our management." Not if we expand, suggesting possibility and discussion. Not Daniel and the team, acknowledging the collaborative nature of our business structure. She said we and our management, and when, with a certainty that made my blood run cold. She spoke like it was inevitable, like the decision had already been made without consulting anyone else, like she and Daniel already owned what I'd built. The slow burn realization was building inside me, detail by painful detail. Each sign was small on its own, easily explained away by itself, but together they painted a picture I didn't want to see. The picture was ugly and heartbreaking and terrifying. I wanted to be wrong more than I'd ever wanted anything, but the evidence kept accumulating like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late September. I'd gone back to the office to retrieve my keys, which I'd absent-mindedly left in my desk drawer. The building was quiet, the cleaning crew having finished hours earlier. I walked past the copy room and noticed a light still on, and there in the printer tray sat a single document that someone had carelessly forgotten. A wire transfer request, $50,000, to an offshore account I'd never seen before in my life, an account number that meant nothing to me. The destination bank was in the Cayman Islands, I noticed, which immediately raised every alarm bell I had. But it was the signature at the bottom that made my knees weak and my vision blur. The authorization signature looked exactly like mine. The loop of the 5 in Valerie, the confident stroke through Curtis, the distinctive way I cross my T's. Every detail was perfect, indistinguishable from my actual signature. But I never signed that document. I'd never even seen it before, and I certainly never authorized a $50,000 transfer to an offshore account. I sat in my car in the parking garage for over an hour. That document trembled in my hands as various explanations ran through my mind, each more disturbing than the last. The fluorescent lights hummed above me with an irritating buzz that matched the chaos in my head. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm went off, and I jumped at the sound like I'd been physically struck. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and searched for private investigators in my area. I scrolled through websites and reviews, looking for someone with experience, someone discreet, someone who could help me understand what was happening. I found one named James Porter with 20 years of experience in financial fraud investigation and family cases. I booked an appointment for the very next day. My finger hovered over the confirm button for a long moment before I pressed it, because part of me knew that once I started down this path, there would be no going back. I needed to know if I was being paranoid, if I was imagining threats that didn't exist, if my age was making me suspicious and irrational, or I needed to know if I was already being erased from my own life by the people I loved most. What the investigator found in just 2 weeks made me realize the truth. I wasn't losing my mind or imagining things or being paranoid without cause. I was losing everything else, and the theft had been happening right under my nose for longer than I could bear to imagine. I met James Porter in a quiet cafe on the other side of town. It was far from my neighborhood, far from my office, far from anyone who might recognize me and wonder what I was doing there. I felt like a stranger in my own city as I drove there, constantly checking my rearview mirror like I was being followed. Every car behind me seemed suspicious. Every pedestrian seemed to be watching, and I was jumping at shadows that probably didn't exist. Seeking truth when you're terrified of what you'll find isn't weakness. It's actually the bravest thing a person can do, I've come to realize. It takes more courage to face potential devastation than to hide from it in comfortable denial. I'd built a company from nothing, faced down competitors and economic downturns and every challenge the business world could throw at me. But nothing had ever terrified me quite like this. James Porter was exactly what I'd hoped for when I'd read his profile online. He was professional and thorough, with kind eyes that had clearly seen their share of family tragedies and human betrayal. He didn't look shocked or judgmental when I started explaining my suspicions, just attentive and focused. His demeanor put me at ease even though nothing about this situation was easy. "I need to know everything, Mr. Porter," I told him, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Inside I was shaking, terrified, barely holding myself together, but somehow I managed to project calm. Bank accounts, wire transfers, new insurance policies, legal documents, property deeds, everything. Leave nothing unchecked, no stone unturned. I need the complete truth, whatever that truth might be. He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. He looked at me directly, his expression serious and concerned, like a doctor about to deliver bad news to a patient. "Mrs. Curtis, I've been doing this work for 20 years now. I've seen families torn apart by things far less serious than what you're describing." He paused, weighing his words carefully before continuing. "If what you suspect is true, if your instincts are correct about this, it won't just hurt. It'll destroy everything you thought you knew about your family and your life." I met his gaze without flinching, without looking away. My father's words came back to me across the decades. Words he'd spoken when I was just a young girl starting out in business with more ambition than sense. He'd been a coal miner who never finished high school, but he understood truth and integrity better than most educated men I'd met. "I'd rather live with a painful truth than die in a beautiful lie, Mr. Porter. My father taught me that when I was 17, and I've never forgotten it." He nodded slowly, seeming to understand something essential about my character. He took my case right there, had me sign a contract and pay a retainer. We shook hands, and I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me despite the circumstances. At least I was doing something, taking action, refusing to be a passive victim of whatever was happening to me. For the next 2 weeks, I lived in 2 completely separate worlds. In one world, James Porter was working late into the night on my behalf, and I knew it even though I couldn't see it. He was reviewing documents with a fine-tooth comb, making discreet calls to his network of contacts, accessing financial databases I didn't even know existed. I imagined him in some small, cluttered office with papers spread across every surface, the desk lamp the only light, methodically building a case against my own son. In the other world, the world everyone else could see, I performed normalcy. I attended family dinners and smiled at appropriate moments and asked about everyone's week like nothing was wrong. I made small talk about the weather and television shows and neighborhood gossip. The mask of normalcy was suffocating, pressing against my face like a pillow trying to smother me, but I wore it anyway because I had to. I felt like I was watching myself from outside my body. I could see this woman who looked like me going through the motions of a life that no longer felt real or mine. She laughed at jokes that weren't funny, she hugged people she was afraid of, she pretended everything was fine when everything was falling apart. The dissociation was disturbing but necessary for survival. One afternoon, Hattie invited me for coffee at her house. We sat in her pristine living room with its white furniture and abstract art, surrounded by expensive things I'd helped them buy. She studied me with those sharp, calculating eyes while pretending to be concerned. Her head tilted to one side in a gesture of sympathy that felt rehearsed and false. "You've been so quiet lately, Mom. So distant and preoccupied." Her voice dripped with false concern that made my skin crawl. "Everything okay with you? You'd tell us if something was wrong, wouldn't you? We're family, and family takes care of each other." She reached across and patted my hand, and it took everything in me not to flinch away from her touch. She was testing me, I realized. Probing for cracks in my performance, looking for signs that I suspected something, checking to see if their cover was still secure. This wasn't concern or love or family checking on family. This was a predator making sure her prey was still unaware of the trap closing around it. "Just tired, dear," I said, taking a sip of coffee I couldn't taste. My taste buds had shut down from stress, and everything tasted like ash and cardboard. "Getting older, you know. Doctor says I need more rest and less stress." I manufactured a weak smile that probably looked as fake as it felt. "Nothing to worry about, I promise." But inside, my mind was screaming with rage and fear. I was analyzing every word she said, every micro-expression that crossed her face, every gesture and inflection. I was looking for the truth beneath the surface performance, searching for cracks in her mask the way she was searching for cracks in mine. We were two actors in a play, both pretending, both lying, both waiting for the other to break first. Before I went to sleep each night, I'd look at the family photos on my nightstand. They were photos I'd looked at 1,000 times before, images I'd treasured as proof of a happy family and a life well lived. Daniel as a toddler sitting on my shoulders at the park, his chubby hands gripping my hair, both of us laughing at something long forgotten. Hattie on their wedding day, beautiful in white lace, me standing beside her with tears of joy streaming down my face because I thought I'd gained a daughter. I was saying goodbye to that version of reality. Those happy moments had happened, the photos proved it, but they'd been built on foundations I'd thought were solid when they were actually made of sand. Everything I'd believed about my family and my life was being reassessed, reframed, reconsidered in this new and terrible light. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after our first meeting. I was in my garden, deadheading roses, and trying to think about anything except the investigation, when my phone rang. James Porter's name appeared on the screen, and my heart immediately started racing. His voice was tight, controlled, stripped of the warmth he'd shown in our initial meeting. "Mrs. Curtis, we need to meet immediately." There was no greeting, no small talk, just urgent necessity. Not the cafe this time, my office. "What I found, what I've discovered about your family." He paused, and I could hear him take a deep breath. "You need to be sitting down for this conversation. You need to be somewhere private and safe." I drove to his office in a complete daze. My hands shook on the steering wheel so badly I could barely keep the car straight in its lane. I ran a red light at the intersection of Maple and 5th, and didn't even realize it until I heard the horn blaring behind me and saw the angry driver gesturing. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my temples, in my fingertips gripping the wheel. I thought I wanted answers, I really did. I thought I was prepared for whatever he'd found, that I'd steeled myself for the worst possibilities. I'd imagined embezzlement and theft and betrayal, had tried to mentally prepare myself for those realities. But I was wrong about being prepared, wrong about understanding what I was walking into, wrong about everything. I was about to discover that the truth was so much worse than anything I'd imagined in my darkest fears. James Porter's office was small and meticulously organized. Filing cabinets lined one wall, labeled and color-coded in a way that suggested obsessive attention to detail. His modest desk sat in the center of the room with 2 chairs facing each other across its surface. The walls were bare except for his licensing certificates, and there were no personal photos or decorations to soften the professional atmosphere. He stood when I entered, and I could see from his face that what he'd found was catastrophic. His usual professional composure had cracked slightly, and there was genuine distress in his eyes. He looked like a man who'd seen something he wished he could unsee, like a doctor who has to tell a patient they're dying. The air in the room felt heavy with dread, thick enough to choke on. He slid a thick manila folder across his desk with the gravity of a judge delivering a death sentence. His hands lingered on it for a moment, as if he was reluctant to let it go, reluctant to put this knowledge into my possession. "Mrs. Curtis, you'll want to sit down for this, please." It wasn't a suggestion but a medical necessity, because he knew what was coming would knock me down if I was standing. I sat in the chair opposite him, my legs suddenly weak. My hands were already trembling before I even opened the folder, before I knew what horrors it contained. I could feel my pulse in my neck, rapid and thready, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the room. Inside the folder was a document, clean, professional, official-looking. It had the weight and appearance of legitimacy, the kind of document you'd find in any lawyer's office or courthouse filing. At the top, in formal legal language, were the words, "Last Will and Testament of Valerie Marie Curtis." My name, my company, my life's work reduced to legal terms and numbered paragraphs. And there at the bottom, in the place where testators sign to make their wishes legally binding, was my signature. It was perfect, unmistakable, exactly like the thousands of signatures I'd written over 4 decades of business. The loop of the 5, the confident stroke through Curtis, every detail was flawless. But I never signed this document. I'd never seen it before in my life. I'd never been to a notary to execute a new will, never discussed changing my estate plans with anyone, never made any decisions about altering the inheritance I'd carefully structured years ago to protect all my children equally. I started reading through tears that blurred the words. With each sentence, each clause, each legal phrase, the room seemed to tilt further off its axis. My vision narrowed to a tunnel, and I had to grip the arms of the chair to keep from falling. The words swam on the page, but their meaning was brutally, devastatingly clear. The sole beneficiaries of the Curtis empire were listed as Daniel Curtis and Hattie Morrison, not Daniel and his siblings to be divided equally. Not all my children sharing in what I'd built for their futures. Just Daniel and Hattie, taking everything while the others got nothing. Richard, my firstborn who'd moved across the ocean to run our European operations. Richard, who'd sacrificed time with his own children to build that branch with integrity and dedication. Richard, who called me every Sunday without fail to check on me and share his week. He'd been completely removed from my will as if he'd never existed, as if he wasn't my son. Kate, my only daughter, my girl who'd built our charity division into something that genuinely changed lives. Kate, who'd inherited my compassion and my drive and my stubborn refusal to accept that some problems can't be solved. Kate, who'd named her firstborn after me and told me I was her hero. She'd been erased, too, written out of her inheritance as if she meant nothing. 40 years of my legacy stolen with the stroke of a forged pen. 40 years of sacrifice and hard work and careful planning, all redirected to benefit 2 people while excluding the others. The injustice of it, the cruelty, the calculated malice, it all crashed over me like a wave trying to drown me. "The signature is perfect, Mrs. Curtis." James's voice seemed to come from very far away, like he was speaking to me from the other end of a long tunnel. They used sophisticated software, probably AI-based technology that's become more accessible in recent years. They studied your signature patterns extensively, analyzed the pressure you apply with the pen, examined the subtle variations in your handwriting over time. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was tight with controlled anger. "This was meticulously planned, Mrs. Curtis. This wasn't impulsive or opportunistic. This was deliberate, calculated, methodical. How do you forgive someone who didn't just betray you in a moment of weakness? How do you forgive someone who sat down and planned your destruction over months or years? How do you forgive someone who not only stole from you but erased your children's birthright, who tried to destroy the legacy you'd built for all of them? I couldn't answer those questions then, and I still can't answer them now. I couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come, wouldn't form, wouldn't push past the lump of grief and rage lodged in my throat. I couldn't breathe properly, each breath coming in short, painful gasps, like I'd been running for miles. Tears streamed down my face and dripped onto the document, smudging the ink slightly, and I didn't even try to wipe them away because what was the point? This wasn't just theft of money or property or assets. This was erasure, annihilation, the destruction of everything I'd tried to build and protect. They were writing my children, my innocent children who'd done nothing wrong, out of existence as far as my legacy was concerned. They were taking everything I'd worked for and claiming it as their own while leaving Richard and Kate with nothing, not even an acknowledgement of their worth. They weren't just stealing my money, James. My voice broke on every word, shattering like glass dropping on concrete. They weren't just taking what I'd built for myself. They were erasing Richard and Kate's future, everything I'd created for all my children to share. The words came out as half sobs, barely intelligible through my crying. Everything I built for all of them, everything I sacrificed and worked for, they were taking it all and leaving the others with nothing. James pointed to the notarization date with his pen. The date was printed clearly at the bottom of the document, official and legal and impossible to misread. 3 months ago, 3 months, 90 days since this document had been notarized and filed, and made legally binding according to anyone who didn't know it was a fraud. Right after that Sunday dinner. Right after Hattie had laughed at me and told me I didn't understand money while my own son sat silent beside her. Right after that moment when I'd felt something fundamental shift in my family's dynamic. The timing wasn't a coincidence, couldn't possibly be a coincidence. It was already in motion while I was carving the roast, while I was pouring wine and asking about everyone's week and trying to be the good mother who brought her family together, while I was setting the table with my grandmother's china and hoping Hattie would feel welcomed and loved. The plan to destroy me was already filed in some courthouse downtown, already legally binding, already set in stone. All those Sunday dinners where I'd served them food I'd cooked with love. All those morning phone calls where Daniel had said, "I love you, Mom," at the end of our conversations. All those family gatherings where we'd hugged and laughed and taken photos that looked like evidence of a happy family. Every single moment had been a lie, a performance, a mask hiding the conspiracy happening behind my back. "How long, James?" I heard myself whisper the question even though I was terrified of the answer. How long have they been planning to destroy me? How long have they been working on this betrayal while pretending to love me? I needed to know the scope of the deception, even though knowing would make it worse. He opened another folder with reluctant hands. More documents spilled out. More evidence of planning and preparation and deliberate malice. Financial records and email printouts and research documents that painted a picture of conspiracy. Based on what I've found so far, and I'm still digging deeper. He met my eyes with genuine sympathy. At least 18 months, Mrs. Curtis, maybe longer. This wasn't impulsive or spontaneous or done in a moment of weakness. This was calculated, methodical, planned with patience and precision. 18 months, a year and a half, 78 weeks of deception, 547 days of lies. Every one of those days they were plotting against me while I loved them and trusted them and welcomed them into my home and my business and my life. Every hug had been false, every smile had been calculated, every "I love you" had been a weapon designed to keep me compliant and unsuspecting. I sat there in that small, sterile office while tears dried on my cheeks in salty tracks. The grief was still there, sharp and fresh and devastating enough to cut me in half. It was a physical pain in my chest, a crushing weight that made it hard to draw breath. But beneath the grief, something else was forming, something I'd never felt before in my entire life, something hard, something steel, something that felt like the temperature had dropped below freezing inside my chest where my heart used to be. The woman who'd walked into this office was dying, and someone new was being born from the ashes of that death. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I sat up straighter in my chair, forcing my spine to uncurl from its protective hunch. I looked James Porter directly in the eye with a gaze that I could feel had changed, had hardened, had transformed into something that would have frightened the old Valerie. "Show me everything else." My voice was steady now, cold, stripped of emotion and weakness. Every document they forged, every transaction they made, every lie they told, and every crime they committed. I could feel my jaw clenching with determination. I want to see it all, every ugly detail. I want to know exactly what they've done and how they did it. And then I want to know how we stop them and make them pay for every bit of it. This pain wasn't the end of my story. This devastating betrayal wasn't going to be the final chapter of my life. This was the fuel for everything that was coming next, the catalyst that would transform me from victim into something they never expected. They'd made a critical mistake when they'd assumed I was weak enough to destroy, too old and too trusting to fight back. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. James opened the second folder with the same careful deliberation he'd shown with the first. His movements were measured, almost reluctant, like each revelation was causing him personal pain on my behalf. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the tight line of his mouth, the way his fingers hesitated before lifting the cover. He knew what was inside would devastate me further, would add another layer to the nightmare I was already living. HD Consulting LLC. The name was printed across the top of the first document in bold official lettering that made it look legitimate and professional. Registered in the Cayman Islands, a notorious tax haven where companies go to hide money from authorities and scrutiny. A shell company I recognized immediately because I'd built a legitimate business empire and understood corporate structures, tax jurisdictions, legal entities, and how they could be manipulated for illegal purposes. But I'd never imagined seeing my own family's initials on one of these fraudulent entities. H for Hattie, D for Daniel, their company, their conspiracy. My money flowing into their pockets through a carefully constructed maze of legal paperwork designed to hide theft in plain sight. The document listed the owners clearly, Hattie Morrison and Daniel Curtis. Not Daniel Curtis and wife, not a joint marital account. Their names were separate, distinct, equal partners in this theft. This wasn't Daniel being manipulated or led astray by a controlling spouse. This was a partnership, a collaboration, two people working together toward a common goal of destroying me financially. The transfers started small, James explained, spreading bank statements across the desk like cards in the world's cruelest game. His finger traced a path through the numbers, showing me the pattern I'd been too blind to see. 15,000 here in March, 22,000 there in April, 30,000 in May. The statements covered the desk's surface. Months and months of systematic theft documented in cold, hard numbers. Each transfer was carefully calculated, deliberately kept below the federal reporting threshold. They'd researched the exact amounts that would avoid triggering automatic alerts to banking authorities and the IRS. This wasn't amateur theft or impulsive crime. This was sophisticated financial fraud, executed by people who understood the system and knew how to exploit its weaknesses. They spread them over 14 months to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements, James continued. His voice was clinical now, professional, explaining the mechanics of how I'd been robbed. Any single transaction over $10,000 gets reported automatically. They knew that. So they kept everything just under the radar, just small enough to slip through unnoticed. I stared at the numbers, watching them blur and refocus through my tears. The columns of figures swam on the page, but their meaning was devastatingly clear. Each number represented a piece of my life's work stolen while I smiled at family dinners. Each transfer happened while I was telling them I loved them, while I was proud of them, while I was trusting them with my company and my future. How much total? The question came out as a whisper because I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Part of me wanted to remain ignorant, to not have to face the full scope of what they'd taken. But I needed to know. I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting to recover. $2.3 million. James said it quietly, gently, like he was trying to soften the blow with his tone even though the numbers were unchanged by his delivery. The room swayed. $2.3 million. The number was so large it felt abstract at first, impossible to grasp fully. Then the reality crashed over me in waves of understanding. That wasn't just numbers on a page or abstract wealth or meaningless figures. That was real money with real consequences for real people I loved. That was Richard's children's college funds I'd been setting aside for years. That was his daughter Emma's dream of studying architecture at Cornell and his son Thomas's hope of becoming a doctor. That was Kate's plan to expand the charity division to 3 new cities, to help hundreds more families escape poverty. That was my retirement security, my medical care in old age, my peace of mind that I'd earned through 4 decades of hard work. That was stability and safety and futures that had been stolen while I was being told I didn't understand money. The irony was so bitter I could taste it like poison on my tongue. I understood money better than they ever would. I understood that money represents more than numbers. It represents time and effort and sacrifice and dreams and security and the ability to help people you love. They disguise them as consulting fees, operational costs, vendor payments, James continued, laying out invoice after invoice. The paper trail spread across his desk was extensive, damning, meticulously documented, each one bearing your authorization signature. Forged, just like the will. Same sophisticated software, same careful attention to detail. He laid out invoice after invoice and I recognized every single one. The vendor names were familiar, the amounts seemed reasonable, the purposes listed were plausible. I remembered signing some of them, or at least I thought I'd signed them. Now I had no idea which signatures were mine and which were forgeries. How many had I actually signed? How many times had I authorized my own theft without knowing it? I taught Daniel everything about running this business. My voice sounded hollow, defeated, drained of the energy I'd always prided myself on having. Every principle of accounting, every strategy for growth, every technique for managing cash flow and protecting assets. The words tasted like ashes in my mouth. I shared 40 years of experience with him because I trusted him to use that knowledge to protect what we'd built. And he used every single lesson, every piece of wisdom I gave him, to rob me blind while looking me in the eye. James traced his finger along a timeline he'd constructed on a separate sheet. The visual representation made the conspiracy even more real, more planned, more devastating. The first transfer was made 2 months after Daniel and Hattie's wedding, April 15th, 2 months to the day after their February ceremony. 2 months, 8 weeks, 60 days after I'd welcomed her into our family with open arms and an open heart. Their honeymoon in Bali had been beautiful according to the photos they'd shared, sunset beaches and romantic dinners and tour of ancient temples. I'd given them $10,000 as a wedding gift, more than I could comfortably afford but less than I wanted to give because I loved my son and wanted his marriage to start on solid financial footing. I remembered Hattie hugging me at the wedding reception with tears in her eyes. She'd whispered, "Thank you for welcoming me into your family," and I'd hugged her back, crying too, thinking I'd gained a daughter I'd always wanted. That moment had seemed so genuine, so emotionally real, so full of promise for our future relationship. Now I understood it had all been performance. 2 months after that wedding, after those tears and hugs and promises, they started stealing from me. The honeymoon wasn't just a romantic getaway for newlyweds in love. It was the birth of their conspiracy, the beginning of their calculated plan to rob me of everything I'd worked for. Maybe they'd planned it on those sunset beaches. Maybe they'd laughed about it over romantic dinners. "We also obtained email records," James said carefully, pulling out printed pages with highlighted sections. His caution told me this evidence was damning, legally obtained with subpoena-ready documentation that will hold up in any court. Hattie was researching offshore banking 6 months before the wedding. Wire transfer limits, corporate fraud penalties, international banking regulations, and how to avoid detection. 6 months before the wedding. Half a year before she'd stood in white lace and promised to love and honor my son. She'd been planning this crime before she'd finalized the wedding venue, before she'd chosen her dress, before we'd addressed invitations together at my dining room table. She knew exactly what they were going to do and what they could get away with, and she'd researched it with the same thoroughness most brides apply to choosing flowers. I welcomed her into our family with open arms and genuine love. I threw her a bridal shower with 30 of my closest friends, spent $2,000 on decorations and food because I wanted her to feel celebrated. I stood beside her at the altar and cried tears of joy, believing I was witnessing my son marry his soulmate. I gave her access to everything: my home, my business, my trust, my heart, my family's future. "This is my fault," I whispered, and the guilt was crushing. It pressed down on my chest like a physical weight, making it hard to draw breath. I trusted her. I trusted them both. I opened every door, gave them every opportunity, handed them the keys to everything I'd built. My hands were shaking as I touched the documents. This is my fault for being stupid enough to believe that love and family meant something to them. "Mrs. Curtis," James started to object, but I cut him off. "No, you don't understand. I saw red flags and ignored them. I felt something was wrong and told myself I was being paranoid. I noticed inconsistencies and made excuses for them because I didn't want to believe my own son would do this to me. The self-recrimination poured out of me like poison I needed to purge. I failed to protect myself and my other children because I was too blind, too trusting, too naive." James leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "Mrs. Curtis, con artists are experts at exploiting trust. That's not a character flaw in their victims. It's the defining characteristic that makes con artists successful." He held my gaze, willing me to understand. "They target good people, loving people, trusting people because those are the people who can be manipulated through their own decency. This is their crime, not your mistake. Your only mistake was being a decent human being who loved her son and wanted to believe the best of people." But his words couldn't penetrate the wall of guilt crushing my chest. I'd spent my entire life being smart and cautious and careful in business. I'd built an empire by trusting my instincts and protecting my assets and seeing through people who wanted to use me. How had I missed this? How had I been so blind when it came to my own family? He showed me more statements, more evidence of the systematic theft. The pattern of escalation was clear once you knew to look for it, once you understood what you were seeing. Starting small in April, $10,000, testing to see if anyone would notice. Then growing bolder in May and June as they realized they wouldn't get caught, that no one was monitoring them closely enough. By December, they were transferring $50,000 every single week. Every week. From my accounts to theirs, while I was shopping for their Christmas presents and planning holiday dinners, while I was stuffing their stockings with thoughtful gifts and cooking their favorite foods and trying to make the season special for my family. This wasn't just $2.3 million in abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. This was deeply, devastatingly personal. This was the future I'd built brick by brick being systematically dismantled by the people who were supposed to protect it. This was Richard's children's security and Kate's dreams and my retirement and everything I'd sacrificed for. Stolen, while I smiled and trusted and loved people who were betraying me. My voice barely rose above a whisper. "James, is there more?" I was almost afraid to ask, terrified of what else he might have found. "Please tell me this is everything. Please tell me it can't get worse than forged wills and stolen millions. Please tell me I've seen the worst of what they've done." His face went pale, the color drained from his cheeks like someone had pulled a plug, and his hand trembled slightly as he reached for a third folder. This one was thinner than the others, but somehow it felt heavier, more ominous, more terrifying. His hand hesitated over it for a long moment. "Mrs. Curtis," he said quietly, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and my stomach dropped like I'd missed a step in the dark. "What I'm about to show you suggests something I never wanted to have to tell a client. This goes beyond financial fraud. This is darker." He opened the folder slowly, like he was opening Pandora's box and unleashing something terrible into the world. "They didn't just want your money, Mrs. Curtis." His eyes met mine, filled with genuine concern and something that looked like fear. "The evidence suggests they wanted you gone, permanently. They were preparing for your death, and I can't tell if they were planning to wait for it or help it along. James's hands shook slightly as he slid the document across the desk. I'd never seen him nervous before, not during our first meeting or when he'd shown me the forged will or when he'd revealed the offshore accounts. But now his fingers trembled, and that tremor terrified me more than anything else could have. Whatever was in this folder was worse than everything that had come before. A life insurance policy. $5 million. The numbers swam on the page as I tried to focus through the tears that were already forming. Insured party, Valerie Marie Curtis. Date of birth, social security number, medical history attached. Everything was there. Everything was official. Everything looked legitimate and legal and binding. Beneficiaries, Daniel Curtis and Hattie Morrison. No one else. Not Richard, not Kate, not my grandchildren, not the charities I'd supported for decades. Just the two of them, positioned to profit from my death to the tune of $5 million. The policy had been taken out 8 months ago, shortly after they'd filed the forged will, part of a comprehensive plan to acquire everything I owned. I stared at my signature on the application form. The loops were perfect, the pressure precise, the distinctive way I crossed my T's exactly right. It looked exactly like my signature, because they'd gotten very good at forging it, very practiced at being me on paper. I never signed this, James. My voice came out as a whisper, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I swear on my life I never signed this document. I know you didn't, James said, and his voice was grim, heavy with implications I didn't want to understand. The signature analysis shows digital manipulation, same as the will. Same sophisticated software they've been using all along. They've gotten very good at being you, Mrs. Curtis. Too good. He pulled out another document, a technical analysis covered in highlighting and notes. The pressure patterns are slightly too consistent. The ink distribution doesn't match actual pen contact with paper. It's excellent work, but it's still a forgery. The room began to spin around me. The walls tilted at wrong angles and the floor felt unstable beneath my feet. Understanding crashed over me in waves, each one more devastating than the last. They weren't just planning for me to die naturally, were they? The words stuck in my throat, choking me. They were preparing for if I died. Or maybe I couldn't finish the sentence because saying it out loud would make it too real. James's face was grave as he pulled out more papers. Mrs. Curtis, they requested your complete medical history from your physician's office 3 months ago. They claimed they were helping you organize estate planning documents, that you'd ask them to gather everything in one place. He spread the documents across his desk, and I recognized my doctor's letterhead, my medical records, everything private about my health laid bare. They know about your heart condition, your medications, your allergies, every vulnerability you have. The darkest possible question formed in my mind. I could feel it taking shape, heavy and terrible, something I never thought I'd have to ask about my own child. James, tell me the truth. My voice was steadier than I felt, cold and clinical, like I was discussing someone else's life. Were they waiting for me to die naturally? Or were they planning to help it along? The words tasted like poison on my tongue, bitter and burning. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't just angry or heartbroken. I was terrified, genuinely, viscerally afraid for my life, in a way I'd never experienced before. My mind started racing backward through recent months, re-examining every moment through this new and horrible lens. That dizziness last month when I'd had to sit down suddenly during Sunday dinner. That strange stomach pain that had lasted for days after eating Hattie's special casserole. The persistent headaches that had started around the same time the insurance policy was filed. James leaned forward, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. Mrs. Curtis, until we resolve this situation, you need to take immediate precautions for your safety. Don't eat or drink anything they prepare, nothing at all, not even packaged food they hand you. His instructions came rapid fire, urgent, frightening in their specificity. Change all your locks today, right now before you go home. Vary your daily routine so you're unpredictable. Tell someone you trust where you are at all times. Don't be alone with either of them under any circumstances. I drove home in a fog of paranoia and fear. Every memory from the past months became suspicious, tainted, recontextualized through the lens of potential murder. Daniel insisting I try Hattie's special herbal tea that she'd supposedly learned about from a wellness expert. Hattie offering to organize my medications, claiming my pillbox system was outdated and confusing, the vitamins she'd been giving me for months, telling me they were essential for bone health at my age, watching to make sure I swallowed them. Had they been vitamins at all? Or had they been something else, something designed to weaken me gradually? That dizziness, those headaches, that stomach pain, were they natural or were they the early stages of something worse? I thought about all the times I'd been alone with them, all the opportunities they'd had, all the moments when I'd been vulnerable and trusting and completely unaware of any danger. I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. The house that had always been my sanctuary now felt threatening, full of shadows and possibilities I didn't want to imagine. I looked at every door, every window, wondering if they had keys I didn't know about. I thought about all the times they'd been here alone, all the access they'd had to my space and my things and my life. Standing in my empty kitchen with the insurance policy in my shaking hands, I made my decision. The fear crystallized into something harder, something determined, something that felt like cold fury mixed with survival instinct. I'm not waiting to find out if they'll act on this. I said it out loud to the empty room, to myself, to whatever God might be listening. I'm not giving them the chance to hurt me. I'm not going to be their victim. This ends now, on my terms, with my choice. I pulled out my phone and found the locksmith's number. Then I called an alarm company. Then I texted Kate and Richard, telling them I needed to talk to them urgently about Daniel and Hattie. I was done being passive, done being the trusting mother who made excuses for inexcusable behavior. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one from someone who'd built an empire from nothing and wasn't about to let them take it. I texted Daniel the next morning after a sleepless night. My message was simple, controlled, giving nothing away about what I knew or what I was planning. We need to talk. Come to the house tomorrow evening. Come alone, it's important. 3 sentences that would change everything, that would force the confrontation I'd been avoiding out of love and hope and stupid maternal optimism. He responded within minutes. Of course, Mom. Is everything okay? The false concern in his text made me want to throw my phone across the room. Everything was not okay. Nothing had been okay for 18 months, and he knew it because he was the one who'd destroyed okay. 6 p.m., he added, and I confirmed. 6 p.m., the same time we usually had Sunday dinner, the same time when families were supposed to gather in love and safety. I spent the day arranging evidence. Every document James had given me I spread across the dining room table in careful categories. The forged will in the center, impossible to miss when you walked in. The offshore account statements arranged in chronological order showing the escalation of theft. The insurance policy placed prominently at the head of the table where I usually sat. It was a visual indictment, a paper trail of betrayal, evidence that spoke louder than any words I could say. This was the same table where Hattie had laughed at me, the same table where she'd told me I didn't understand money, while Daniel sat silent and complicit. Now it would be the table where I showed them exactly how much I understood, how completely I'd unraveled their conspiracy, how thoroughly they'd underestimated me. Daniel arrived at exactly 6 p.m., He walked in with that easy smile I'd loved since he was a toddler, the smile that had always melted my heart and made me forgive anything. "Hey, Mom, what's going on?" His tone was casual, unconcerned, like this was just another normal evening. But the smile faltered when he saw my face, when he registered the coldness in my eyes that had never been there before. Then he saw the documents spread across the table. Every piece of paper, every page of evidence, every proof of his crimes displayed like exhibits in a courtroom. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. His hand reached out and grabbed the doorframe for support. "Mom, what's—" His voice cracked, and he couldn't finish the sentence. "Sit down, Daniel." My voice was ice. Absolute zero, colder than I'd ever spoken to any of my children in their entire lives. There was no warmth in it, no motherly affection, no love softening the edges, just cold, hard authority that came from somewhere deep inside me I hadn't known existed. "Sit down now." He sat like a child called to the principal's office, like a criminal caught at the scene. like someone who knew their life was about to end. I walked around the table slowly, deliberately, letting him see everything laid out before him. I didn't yell because yelling would have suggested I'd lost control, and I needed him to see how completely in control I was. I didn't cry because tears would have suggested weakness, and I was done being weak. Let's start with the will, shall we? My finger touched the forged document, my signature, perfect in every detail, except I never signed it. I moved to the next section. Then we have the offshore accounts. HD Consulting, your initials, Hattie's initials, $2.3 million stolen from me, from Richard, from Kate, from everyone in this family except the two of you. My voice remained steady, clinical, detached. Consulting fees that didn't exist, vendor payments to companies that aren't real, my forged signature on every single transfer. Mom, I can explain, Daniel started, his voice desperate, pleading, trying to find the words that would make this okay somehow. I cut him off with a raised hand. Don't. The single word stopped him mid-breath. Don't insult me further with lies when I'm looking at documented evidence of every crime you've committed. I have bank records going back 18 months. I have emails showing Hattie researching offshore banking before your wedding. I have signature analysis proving forgery. I have everything, Daniel, everything. The tears started then, rolling down his face in streams. It was Hattie's idea. His voice broke, desperate to shift blame, desperate to make himself less guilty somehow. She said we deserved more, that you were holding us back from our potential with your old-fashioned ideas about wealth. She planned everything, Mom. She researched it all, set up the accounts, created the documents. His hands were shaking as he gestured at the evidence. I just went along with it. You just went along? My voice rose slightly, the only crack in my controlled fury. You just went along with forging my will and erasing your brother and sister from their inheritance? You just went along with stealing millions of dollars? You just went along with taking out a $5 million life insurance policy on your mother? I picked up that document, held it in front of his face. This policy suggests you were prepared for my death, Daniel. Were you waiting for it, or were you planning to help it along? No. He stood up so fast his chair fell backward. Mom, no, we would never. But his denial rang hollow against the evidence, against the medical records they'd obtained, against the pattern of escalating crimes. I moved to stand in front of him. You removed Richard and Kate from their inheritance. Your own brother and sister who never did anything to you, who loved you, who would have done anything for you. My voice was quiet again, but harder now, sharp enough to cut. Children I loved equally, children who deserved equal treatment. You looked me in the eye every Sunday for 18 months while planning to destroy this family and steal everything I'd built for all of you. I picked up my phone and set it on the table. You have 24 hours to turn yourself in to the police, both of you. Wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy, all of it. I looked him directly in the eyes. If you do it voluntarily, maybe they'll consider cooperation as a mitigating factor. Maybe the judge will go easier on you, maybe. I picked up my purse. If you don't turn yourselves in, I will file charges myself. Either way, this ends. I walked to the door, then turned back. And Daniel? Either way, regardless of what you choose to do in the next 24 hours, you are no longer my son. That relationship died the moment you chose to betray this family. I left him standing there among the evidence of his crimes, crying in the house where he'd grown up, and I didn't look back. 24 hours passed in silence. My phone never rang with Daniel's number. No text messages appeared apologizing or explaining or begging for another chance. No knock came at my door with him standing there ready to confess and face the consequences of his actions. Just deafening, absolute silence that told me everything I needed to know about his character and his choices. He'd chosen to run rather than face what he'd done. He'd chosen to hide rather than take responsibility. He'd chosen himself and Hattie over any possibility of redemption or repair. That silence was his final answer, his last betrayal, his ultimate rejection of everything I'd tried to teach him about integrity and honor and doing the right thing even when it was hard. I called Detective Sarah Martinez at exactly 6 p.m., 24 hours to the minute after my ultimatum expired. My hands were steady as I dialed, steadier than they'd been in weeks. "I'm ready to file charges," I told her when she answered. "Wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and I want you to investigate possible attempted murder." My voice was calm, businesslike, like I was reporting a break-in rather than turning in my own son. "I have everything you'll need. 3 years of documented crimes, all organized and ready for prosecution." At the police station, I sat across from Detective Martinez in a small interview room. I presented folder after folder of evidence, organized chronologically and by crime type: financial records, forged documents, email correspondence, expert analysis of the signature forgeries, the insurance policy with notes about the medical records they'd obtained. She flipped through page after page, her eyes widening as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. "Mrs. Curtis, this is extensive." She looked up at me with something like respect mixed with pity. "The evidence is airtight. With what you've provided, getting arrest warrants won't be a problem at all. I'll take this to the prosecutor today." She paused. "Are you sure you want to do this? Once we make arrests, there's no taking it back. Your son will have a criminal record. He'll likely serve time." "I'm sure," I said, and I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. He made his choices. Now he lives with the consequences. The arrest warrants were issued that afternoon, multiple felony counts for each of them: wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy. The prosecutor recommended no bail due to flight risk and the substantial financial resources they'd stolen. Judge signed off on everything within hours. The system, when presented with clear evidence and obvious guilt, moved with surprising speed. They came for Daniel and Hattie at dawn. I'd asked Detective Martinez to call me when they were executing the warrants, and I drove to their neighborhood to watch from a distance. I needed to see this. I needed to witness the moment when consequences caught up with choices. I parked across the street, far enough away to be unobtrusive but close enough to see everything clearly. 6:47 in the morning. 4 police cars pulled up with lights flashing but sirens off. Officers approached the front door in formation, professional and efficient. They knocked, announced themselves, waited the legally required amount of time. Then they knocked again, louder, more insistent. Through the window I could see movement inside, lights coming on, figures moving in panic. The door opened. Daniel stood there in pajama pants and a t-shirt, hair messy from sleep, confusion on his face that quickly turned to understanding, and then terror. Hattie appeared behind him, and unlike Daniel, she didn't look confused at all. She looked furious, cold, calculating even in the moment of her arrest. She'd known this was coming, had probably been waiting for it, had thought they'd have more time to prepare or run. The handcuffs went on with a metallic click that I could hear across the street in the quiet morning air. "Daniel Curtis, Hattie Morrison, you're under arrest for wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud." The Miranda rights followed, that familiar litany from television made real and terrible. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Neighbors emerged from their houses in bathrobes and slippers, coffee cups in hand, phones out recording the spectacle. The public shame Daniel had always been so afraid of, the image he'd worked so hard to maintain, shattered in front of everyone he knew. The successful son, the respectful young businessman, revealed as a criminal being led away in handcuffs. Hattie's eyes scanned the street as they walked her to the police car. She was looking for something, someone, and then her gaze locked onto mine. She saw me sitting in my car across the street, watching her downfall. For a long moment we stared at each other, and the hatred in her eyes was pure and burning. She'd been caught, but she wasn't sorry. She wasn't remorseful. She was just angry that she'd lost. Before they put her in the back of the police car, she called across the street to me. Her voice carried in the quiet morning, clear and sharp and full of venom. "You still don't understand money, do you?" She was smiling, actually smiling, like she'd won something even in handcuffs. "You never did, you stupid old woman. One last attempt to wound me, one final effort to make me feel small and ignorant and less than her." I didn't reply. I didn't flinch. I didn't give her the satisfaction of any reaction at all. I just sat in my car and watched as they put her in the back seat and closed the door. The police cars drove away with my son and his wife, taking them to booking and fingerprints and jail cells. The silence after they left was profound, broken only by neighbors whispering to each other and traffic starting as people headed to work. I drove home slowly, carefully, following every traffic law. And then, alone in my driveway with the garage door closed so no one could see, I broke. Sobs racked my body so violently I couldn't catch my breath. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles were white and my hands ached. I'd won. I'd protected myself and Richard and Kate. I'd stopped them from stealing everything. But my son was gone, arrested, facing years in prison. Victory tasted like ashes and grief, and loss so profound I thought it might kill me. 6 months later, I sat in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and fear. Richard sat on my left, Kate on my right, both of them holding my hands like I was fragile and might shatter at any moment. Maybe I was. Maybe I would. This trial was going to force me to relive every moment of the betrayal publicly, to air my family's shame in front of strangers and cameras, and reporters taking notes for their stories about family dysfunction and white-collar crime. The courtroom was packed. Media filled the back rows, sensing a story that would captivate audiences with its mix of wealth and betrayal and family drama. Behind them sat curious members of the public who'd followed the case in the news. At the defendants' table sat Daniel and Hattie with their separate lawyers, because their interests had diverged once the reality of prosecution set in. Prosecutor David Lawson called me to the stand first. I walked up on legs that felt unsteady, raised my right hand, swore to tell the truth as if I'd ever done anything else. Then I sat in the witness box and looked out at the courtroom, carefully avoiding eye contact with Daniel. If I looked at him, I might cry. If I cried, I might not be able to finish my testimony. I needed to be strong for Richard and Kate, for my company, for justice. Mrs. Curtis, please tell the court about your relationship with the defendants. David Lawson's voice was gentle but professional. I told them everything. The Sunday dinners and morning phone calls and trust I'd had in my youngest son, welcoming Hattie into the family with open arms, giving them access to my business because I believed family meant loyalty and love meant protection. Then I told them about the betrayal, the password lockout and missing invoices, the forged will that erased Richard and Kate, the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the insurance policy worth $5 million with my forged signature. My voice remained steady through most of it, breaking only when I described seeing my children's names removed from my will, when I talked about the fear that they might have been planning my death. David Lawson presented the evidence methodically. Each document was projected on screens for the jury to see: the forged will with signature analysis showing digital manipulation, bank statements with highlighted transfers showing the $2.3 million stolen in careful increments, emails showing Hattie researching offshore banking and fraud detection thresholds 6 months before her wedding, the timeline of systematic theft spanning 18 months. Daniel took the stand looking broken. He'd lost weight in jail, and his expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. His lawyer had clearly advised him that his only chance at a lighter sentence was complete honesty and remorse. "I did everything they're accusing me of," he said, his voice barely audible. "The offshore accounts, the forged documents, the insurance policy, all of it." Tears streamed down his face. "It was Hattie's idea, she planned it all, but I went along with it. I'm guilty, I'm so guilty." He turned toward me. "Mom, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know who I became. Please, please forgive me." His lawyer put a hand on his arm, trying to stop him from saying more, but Daniel kept going. "I love you. I never stopped loving you. I just made terrible choices. I chose wrong." His breakdown was complete, genuine, devastatingly too late. Hattie's testimony was entirely different. She sat in the witness box with perfect posture, dressed in conservative colors her lawyer had clearly chosen to make her look sympathetic, but her eyes were cold, calculating, unrepentant. "Mrs. Curtis was hoarding generational wealth," she said calmly, like she was explaining something obvious to children. She was holding Daniel back from his full potential, keeping him under her thumb with financial control. Her voice was steady, unapologetic. "We deserved our share of what he'd helped build. We were taking what should have been ours anyway. So you don't regret your actions? David Lawson asked, barely concealing his disbelief. I regret getting caught, Hattie said flatly. I regret underestimating her, but I don't regret trying to secure our financial future. That's just good planning. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Her own lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. She'd just destroyed any possibility of a sympathetic jury, any chance of leniency, any hope for mercy. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict. On the count of wire fraud, we find the defendant Daniel Curtis guilty. On the count of forgery, we find the defendant Daniel Curtis guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant Daniel Curtis guilty. The same verdict repeated for Hattie, guilty on every single count. Daniel's head dropped into his hands. Hattie's jaw clenched, but her face remained impassive. Judge Helen Rodriguez was a stern woman in her 60s with gray hair and eyes that suggested she'd seen every possible variation of human weakness and criminality. She looked at Daniel and Hattie with disappointment and disgust. I've presided over financial fraud cases for 20 years, she said, but I've rarely seen betrayal this calculated, this cruel, this completely devoid of human decency. You didn't just steal money. You tried to erase a mother's other children from their inheritance. You forged documents suggesting preparation for her death. She paused. 3 years in federal prison for each of you. Full restitution of all stolen funds plus penalties and interest. Permanent restraining order preventing any contact with Mrs. Curtis or her other children. Court is adjourned. I was allowed to give a victim impact statement. I stood at the podium, looking at the judge rather than at Daniel because I still couldn't bear to see his face. I didn't want this, I said, and my voice carried through the silent courtroom. I wanted my son. I wanted my family intact. I wanted to believe that love and loyalty meant something. I took a breath, but I couldn't let them destroy what I built for all my children. I couldn't let them erase Richard and Kate's future. I couldn't be a passive victim of my own son's crime. I had no choice but to seek justice, even though justice tastes like ash in my mouth. As they led Daniel and Hattie out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Daniel looked back at me one last time. His eyes were pleading, desperate, filled with regret that came 3 years too late. I held his gaze for 3 long seconds, letting him see my face, letting him understand. Then I deliberately looked away, turned my attention to Richard and Kate beside me. That was the moment Daniel finally understood I was really done. There would be no forgiveness, no reconciliation, no return to the family he'd betrayed. He'd made his choices, and now he would live with the consequences forever. 3 years passed. The company not only survived but thrived under new leadership structures I'd implemented with help from Richard and Kate. The original will was reinstated through legal proceedings, Richard and Kate's inheritances secured and protected. The stolen money was returned through restitution payments that would continue long after Daniel and Hattie left prison. The business adapted, evolved, grew stronger from the crisis that should have destroyed it. Sunday dinners continued at my house because I refused to let Daniel and Hattie's betrayal destroy this family tradition. Richard flew in from London when he could, bringing his wife and children. Kate drove over from across town with her husband and their kids. We gathered around the same dining room table where Hattie had laughed at me, but now the atmosphere was different, lighter somehow despite the loss we all felt. Daniel's chair remained at the table. I couldn't bring myself to remove it, couldn't bear to literally erase him from the family circle even though he'd tried to erase his siblings from their inheritance. The chair sat empty every Sunday, a ghost at every meal, a reminder of what we'd lost and what he'd chosen to throw away. Sometimes I caught myself glancing at it, expecting him to walk through the door apologizing for being late. 3 years. 1,090 to 5 days. Daniel never wrote a letter or made a phone call or sent any message through lawyers or mutual acquaintances. Not one attempt at apology or explanation or request for contact. Not a single effort to rebuild what he'd destroyed or acknowledge the magnitude of what he'd done to this family. The silence was its own statement, its own choice, its own final betrayal. Richard and Kate were endlessly grateful that I'd protected their inheritance and stopped the theft before everything was gone. But they weren't blind to the cost I'd paid. They saw the sadness behind my smiles when they talked about their own children. They noticed the way I looked at Daniel's empty chair and quickly looked away. They understood that saving them had required sacrificing him, and they carried guilt about that even though the situation wasn't their fault. "Mom, you did the right thing," Kate told me often, her hand on mine across the table. "You protected yourself and us. You didn't have a choice." But we both knew that having no choice didn't make the outcome hurt less. Justice and heartbreak could coexist in the same space. I could be right and devastated simultaneously. For the first year of Daniel's imprisonment, letters arrived from Hattie. They came weekly, sometimes twice a week, forwarded through the prison mail system. The first few I opened and read, subjecting myself to page after page of blame and accusations and venom. She claimed I'd destroyed her life out of jealousy and spite. She said I'd never accepted her into the family. She threatened lawsuits and retaliation and revenge when she got out. Her handwriting was sharp, angular, filled with rage. After the third letter, I stopped opening them. I'd pick up the envelope, recognize the prison return address and her handwriting, and walk directly to the fireplace. I'd watch the paper burn and curl and turn to ash without reading a single word. Eventually, around the 15-month mark, the letter stopped coming. Maybe she'd given up. Maybe she'd found new targets for her hatred. Maybe she'd finally understood that her words couldn't touch me anymore. Late at night, when the house was quiet and empty, I asked myself the question that haunted me. Was protecting my legacy worth losing my son? I'd sit in the dark living room with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, staring at family photos from happier times. Daniel as a baby, as a young boy, as a teenager, as a young man before Hattie, before the betrayal, before everything fell apart. The answer came slowly, painfully, but with certainty. I didn't lose him, I'd whispered to the empty room. He chose to leave when he chose betrayal. He chose Hattie over his family. He chose greed and theft over love and loyalty. He chose to erase his brother and sister from their inheritance. The words helped, a little. I just refused to be his victim. I just protected myself and my other children. I just demanded that actions have consequences. 3 years to the day after the sentencing, Daniel was released from federal prison. I knew the exact date because Kate called me that morning, her voice gentle with concern. "Mom, Daniel gets out today. His release is scheduled for 9 a.m. She paused. "Do you want us to be there with you? Do you want support?" She meant well, offering protection, but this was something I needed to do alone. I drove to the federal prison facility on a gray morning that matched my mood. The building was imposing, surrounded by fences and guard towers, a monument to consequences and justice. I parked in the visitor lot and waited in my car, watching the main gate. Part of me wasn't sure why I'd come. I had no plans to speak to him, no desire to reconcile, no forgiveness prepared. I just needed to see him, needed this closure, needed to mark this ending. At 9:15, the gate opened and Daniel walked out. He was thinner than I remembered, harder somehow, aged beyond the 3 years that had passed. Prison had left its mark on him in the lines around his eyes, the wary way he held himself, the defeated slope of his shoulders. He wore civilian clothes someone must have brought him, and he carried a small bag containing his few possessions. Our eyes met across the parking lot. I was sitting in my car 50 feet away, and he saw me immediately. Recognition crossed his face, followed by emotions too complex to name. Hope, maybe. Fear, definitely. Regret so deep it looked like physical pain. He stood frozen, clearly not having expected me to be there, not knowing what to do with this unexpected confrontation. For 30 seconds we stared at each other across the distance. 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, heavy with everything unsaid and everything that could never be repaired. Daniel took one hesitant step toward me, his hand rising slightly like he might wave or call out. Then he stopped, seeming to understand something from my expression, from the way I held myself, from the years of silence that had passed between us. I didn't move, I didn't smile, I didn't cry. I just sat in my car and watched him, my face carefully neutral, offering nothing. Not forgiveness, not condemnation, not hope for future reconciliation. Just acknowledgement that we'd both arrived at this moment through choices he'd made and consequences I'd enforced. After that 30-second eternity, Daniel turned away. He didn't look back again. He walked to the bus stop at the corner and sat on the bench to wait for public transportation, because no one was coming to pick him up. I watched until the bus arrived, watched him climb on board, watched it pull away carrying him to whatever life he'd build now. Then I drove home through streets that felt familiar and strange simultaneously. The company continued to thrive. Richard managed international operations with integrity and intelligence, expanding into new markets without ever cutting corners or betraying trust. Kate grew the charity division beyond my wildest dreams, helping thousands of families escape poverty through education and job training. They proved that my life's work would continue beyond me, that my legacy was secure in hands that deserved it. I started mentoring young entrepreneurs, especially women who reminded me of my younger self. I told them about building something from nothing. I shared strategies for protecting their businesses and their assets. Sometimes, when I trusted them, I told them a version of my story as a cautionary tale about trust and family and the importance of maintaining boundaries, even with the people you love most. I joined a support group for family fraud victims. Every Tuesday evening, 10 of us gathered in a community center basement and shared our stories of betrayal by children, siblings, parents, spouses. Hearing their experiences helped me understand I wasn't alone in this specific kind of devastation. A woman whose brother had stolen her inheritance, a man whose wife had emptied their accounts and disappeared, a mother whose daughter had forged her name on loan documents. We were a community of the betrayed, finding healing in shared understanding. The empty chair at Sunday dinner remained. I couldn't remove it because that felt too final, like declaring him dead rather than just lost. Richard and Kate learned not to mention it, not to suggest I take it away or reassign the seat to someone else. It stayed empty, a physical reminder of absence, a monument to choices and consequences. Sometimes, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, I'd think about that moment in the parking lot. I'd wonder if I should have spoken to him, if I should have offered some small opening for reconciliation. Then I'd remember the forged will with Richard and Kate's names erased. I'd remember the $2.3 million stolen in calculated increments. I'd remember the insurance policy and the fear that they might have been planning my death. The wondering would stop, replaced by certainty that I'd made the only choice possible. 5 years after his release, I received a letter, not from Daniel but from a lawyer representing him. The letterhead was from a small firm in another state, somewhere Daniel had apparently relocated to start over. The letter was formal, carefully worded, and it requested permission for Daniel to attend Richard's wedding. Richard hadn't invited him, the letter explained, but Daniel had heard about it through some distant connection and wanted to be there for his brother's important day. I read the letter 3 times, looking for manipulation or hidden agenda or some trap I wasn't seeing. But it seemed genuine, straightforward, a simple request for one day of family connection. I called Richard immediately. "Did you know about this?" I asked, and he sighed heavily before answering. "I knew he'd found out somehow," Richard said. "I didn't invite him, Mom. I wasn't going to put you through that. Wasn't going to risk him ruining my wedding day with his presence and all the history that comes with it." He paused. "But if you want him there, if you're ready for that, I won't object. He's still my brother, even if he destroyed our family. He's still the person I grew up with, even if I don't know him anymore." I thought about it for a week. I carried that letter with me, read it over and over, searching for the right answer in words that didn't contain one. Kate said it was my decision entirely. Richard maintained his position that he'd accept whatever I chose. The decision was mine alone to make, and the weight of it pressed down on me like physical force. In the end, I wrote back through the lawyer. "Daniel may attend the wedding ceremony only. He may not attend the reception. He may not approach me directly or attempt private conversation. He may not bring a guest. These are my conditions, non-negotiable." The lawyer confirmed Daniel had accepted the terms, grateful for even this limited inclusion. Richard's wedding was beautiful. The ceremony took place in a garden with late afternoon sun filtering through trees. I sat in the front row with Kate and her family, watching my eldest son marry a wonderful woman who loved him. During the ceremony, I felt someone's eyes on me and glanced back 3 rows. Daniel sat alone at the end of a pew, dressed in a modest suit, watching the proceedings with an expression of profound sadness, mixed with something like peace. Our eyes met for just a moment. I saw tears on his face. I saw regret etched so deeply it had become part of his features. I saw a man who'd lost everything that mattered, chasing money that had meant nothing in the end. I felt a moment of something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't pure hatred either. Maybe it was just acknowledgement that we'd both survived, that we'd both continued living despite everything that had broken between us. After the ceremony ended and guests moved toward the reception venue, Daniel walked past me on his way to the parking lot. He slowed as he approached, and for a second I thought he might try to speak despite my conditions. But he just nodded once, a gesture of respect or gratitude or goodbye. Then he continued walking, got in his car, and drove away. I watched him leave, and something in my chest loosened slightly, not healed, but perhaps beginning to heal. That night at the reception, surrounded by family and celebration, Kate raised her glass for a toast. "To my mother," she said, her voice carrying across the room full of people I loved, "the strongest woman I know. She built an empire from nothing. She protected her children when protection was needed. She fought for justice when fighting seemed impossible." Her eyes met mine across the tables. She taught us that love doesn't mean accepting abuse. She taught us that family doesn't mean allowing betrayal. She showed us that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is enforce consequences. The room erupted in applause. Richard was crying, his new wife's hand in his. My grandchildren were watching me with admiration in their young faces. I felt overwhelmed by gratitude for what remained, for what had survived, for these people who still loved me and understood the impossible position I'd been forced into. Later that evening, as the party wound down, I stood alone on the terrace looking at stars. Kate found me there, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders against the cooling air. "You okay, Mom?" she asked softly, and I realized I was crying, though I wasn't sure when the tears had started. "I'm sad," I admitted, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. "I'm sad that Daniel missed most of this beautiful day. I'm sad that he'll never know Richard's wife the way we do, never be part of their lives the way he should have been." I wiped my eyes. I'm sad that he chose what he chose, and I had to respond how I responded, and this is where we ended up. Kate hugged me tightly. "I know, Mom, we all know. But you did the right thing, the only thing you could do." She pulled back to look at my face. "And maybe, someday, when enough time has passed and enough healing has happened, maybe there's a way forward. Not back to what was, that's impossible, but forward to something new." "Maybe," I whispered, though I didn't really believe it. Some breaks are too complete to mend. Some betrayals cut too deep to ever fully heal. But maybe Kate was right that forward was possible even if backward wasn't. Maybe we could find a new kind of relationship built on truth and boundaries rather than the blind trust that had enabled so much damage. 10 years after the trial, I received news that Hattie had been arrested again. Different state, different victim, same crime. She'd married a wealthy widower, gained his trust, begun systematically stealing from him using the exact same methods she'd used on me. But this victim had been more vigilant, had caught her sooner, had pressed charges immediately. She was facing another prison sentence, this time longer because it was a second offense. I felt nothing when I heard the news, not satisfaction or vindication or schadenfreude, not pity or concern or residual anger, just emptiness where emotions about her used to live. She was a stranger who'd once tried to destroy me and failed. Whatever happened to her now was her own doing, her own choices, her own consequences that had nothing to do with me. Daniel, I learned through Richard, had rebuilt a small life. He worked in construction now, physical labor that was honest and straightforward with no opportunities for financial manipulation. He'd remarried, a woman who knew his history and had accepted him anyway. He paid his restitution faithfully every month, would continue paying for another 15 years until the debt was settled. He attended therapy weekly, trying to understand the choices he'd made and become someone better than who he'd been. Richard occasionally had lunch with Daniel when business took him to that area. He'd report back to me afterward, not asking me to forgive or forget, just keeping me informed as if Daniel was a distant relative I might be curious about. I appreciated Richard's kindness in maintaining that connection, even though I couldn't do it myself. The wound was still too fresh, even after a decade, still too raw to risk reopening. My company continued to grow. We expanded into new markets, developed innovative products, earned awards for business excellence and ethical practices. When business publications interviewed me about my success, I always credited the same principles: integrity, transparency, protecting what you build, refusing to be a victim. I never mentioned Daniel or the betrayal directly, but everyone in the business world knew the story. It had become legend, a cautionary tale about family businesses and the importance of oversight. I trained the next generation of leadership carefully. Richard would eventually take over completely, with Kate managing the charitable side as a separate but connected entity. My grandchildren showed interest in the business, asked intelligent questions, demonstrated the work ethic and integrity that would be necessary to continue the legacy. The company would survive beyond me, would thrive in hands I trusted, would continue making a positive impact for generations to come. The question I'd asked myself thousands of times, was it worth it, evolved over the years. In the beginning, the answer was complicated, painful, uncertain. I'd saved my company and protected Richard and Kate, but lost Daniel in the process. The trade-off felt unbearable some days, like I'd chosen wrong even though logic said there was no other choice. But as years passed and perspective deepened, the answer clarified. I hadn't lost Daniel. He'd lost himself when he chose betrayal. I hadn't destroyed our relationship. He'd destroyed it when he'd forged my signature and stolen millions. I hadn't forced this outcome. I'd simply refused to be destroyed by his choices and had enforced consequences that any stranger committing the same crimes would have faced. Was protecting my legacy worth the cost? Yes, because the legacy wasn't just money. It was Richard's security and Kate's dreams and my grandchildren's futures. It was jobs for hundreds of employees who depended on the company. It was charities that relied on our donations. It was the principle that actions have consequences and betrayal can't be forgiven, simply because it's committed by family. That laugh, Hattie's cruel laugh at my dinner table, still echoed sometimes in quiet moments. But I didn't hear disrespect anymore. I didn't hear dismissal or belittlement. I heard the sound of someone who'd underestimated the woman she'd tried to destroy. I heard the beginning of a battle she'd ultimately lost. I heard the moment when everything changed and I became someone new, someone stronger, someone who refused to be a victim. Sitting in my office 20 years after that Sunday dinner, I looked at photos of my family on the wall. Richard with his wife and children, Kate with her husband and kids, my grandchildren graduating, achieving, building their own lives with the opportunities my survival had protected. There was a space where Daniel's family photo would have been, an empty frame that represented loss and choice and consequences. I'd built an empire from nothing once. Then I'd protected that empire from people who tried to destroy it, even when those people were my own son and his wife. The cost had been devastating. The price had been nearly unbearable. But I'd survived. My family had survived. My legacy had survived. And that survival, hard-won and painful as it was, made everything worthwhile. The empty chair at Sunday dinner remained. Maybe it always would. But the people who filled the other chairs were secure, protected, loved. They knew that family meant more than blind loyalty. They understood that love required boundaries. They'd learned that sometimes the cruelest thing you can do is enable destruction, and the kindest thing is to enforce consequences, even when it breaks your heart. I was 78 years old. I'd lived through poverty, built success, survived betrayal, enforced justice, and continued forward. I'd lost a son but saved 2 others. I'd sacrificed one relationship to protect many more. I'd made an impossible choice and lived with the consequences every single day since. Was it worth it? Yes. 1,000 times yes. Not because the outcome was perfect or the pain was gone or the loss was healed, but because the alternative, allowing them to destroy everything I'd built, to erase my other children, to steal the futures of my grandchildren, was unthinkable. I'd chosen survival over sentiment, justice over false peace, protection over pretense. And I would make the same choice again, as many times as necessary for as long as I lived. Because some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight costs you everything you thought you couldn't live without. Your integrity is worth fighting for. Your other children are worth fighting for. Your life's work is worth fighting for. And sometimes, the people you love most will be the ones trying to destroy those things, and you'll have to love yourself and your other children more than you love them. That's not cruelty. That's survival. That's strength. That's the choice I made, and I carry it with both grief and certainty, knowing it was right even though it hurt beyond description. My son made his choices. I made mine. We both live with the consequences, and life somehow, impossibly, continues forward. If this story touched you, if you've experienced betrayal from people you trusted, if you understand the impossible choices that come with loving someone who hurts you, please subscribe, share, and know that you're not alone.